Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Our True Colors. I'm really glad that you're here. There's been a lot going on and a lot of things to think about on top of who we are as people and on top of who we are with complex identities. And I'm so very happy today to welcome our guest, Kalya Castillo, who is here to talk about what identity is like when you're a person who is racially ambiguous or mixed race and navigating these spaces as somebody that's a little bit different than what folks kind of categorize us or try to categorize us to be. Kalya is a licensed counseling psychologist and a researcher based in New York, and she dedicates herself to supporting biracial and multiracial identity development, especially in Black Asian communities. Kalya has a private practice in Manhattan, and she teaches at CUNY, the City University of New York, and works as a university clinician. She helps clients explore how past experiences shape who they are today, while also providing practical tools to manage current challenges. Kalya lives in New York with her husband and her two children, and she's here today to share her insights and her expertise with us. Kalya, I am so very happy that you are here. Really appreciate this.
Thank you so much, Shawna, for having me. It's an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much.
uh, the pleasure is mine, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, especially because the population of people who are mixed race, multiracial, number one, they identify in very many different ways, but also this population is growing. I
Yeah.
keep trying to get that news out there to folks. Like, it's literally the fastest growing racial demographic in the US. And that's, for a couple of reasons. One could be just the sheer number of people has increased. And, the larger generations, the younger generations, specifically thinking about workforce age group, and these cohorts include millennials and Gen Z, but also because we haven't always been able to express how we identify on forms and like in the census and things. It just, the system wasn't set up for that. And once we were able to say, hey, I identify with this and this, please don't force me into a box, we see that number growing. So I think part of it has to do with folks have always been there, just haven't really had the way to express that. And secondly, truly the population is just growing. So I think having folks like you on the show really can help as we continue to unpack this identity. And I say this identity full well knowing and acknowledging that there's no one way to be biracial or multiracial. Before we dig into all that stuff and the nitty gritty, I just wanted to ask you about yourself so that listeners know where you're coming from and what led you down the path where you're helping others. Can you share a little bit about your own identity and how that has contributed to your work that you do today?
Absolutely. I identify as, I'm still figuring out those terms, to be honest, as an adult, but I am Black Asian or Black Japanese. And, every time I think about this question, honestly, I feel like the response kind of changes in terms of what my journey has been. And I discover new things about all the milestones and factors that have come along. But yeah, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in the Riverdale area of the Bronx with a single mom. She's from Japan. And it was her curiosity and her courage and love for music that brought her to the US in her late 20s, early 30s. She was a
I
big
love that.
hippie.
Ah, that's so fun.
Yeah, yeah. She first went to LA, went back, then came to New York and settled down and had me. She and my father did not stay together for long. And so she raised me on her own. And, in terms of my journey, like as I think about it, I feel like early on, my concept of identity was really built upon what people were telling me and what I saw in magazines, what I saw in the media. And even, I did not know any other Black Asian folks for a long time. Later on, we had a couple family friends that were also Black Asian. But other than that, there wasn't necessarily a community that I grew up with that looked like me or had a
Yeah.
similar background. So those messages really came from my mom. And, she spoke Japanese to me in our home. But again, there also weren't a huge Japanese community where I grew up either. And Riverdale not have a huge Black community at that time. It's very diverse now, but that was not the case, 30 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And so I remember just feeling alone and different, for a while. And I looked like the same shade as maybe some peers that were Latina or Latino, but I didn't have the same background. And so when people would ask me what my ethnic background was, it always brought a curious response or, oh, that's weird, that's different, or that's unique. And it felt like something I carried with me, but just felt very distanced also. Yeah, I knew that people would be interested in it. And so I kind of
Mhm.
almost leaned into that and used it a bit. And but I felt very disconnected. I knew it was a point of curiosity for other people. That, changed also as I hit puberty. And my relationship to my identity was also interesting at that point too. I was an art student at LaGuardia High School in New York City, which it's for art and performing arts students. And I often would go to the museum, and I remember someone coming up to me and saying, "Wow, you look like a Gauguin painting." And if you know a bit about Gauguin, you would
Excuse me.
these were these were Tahitian women with their breasts out and displayed, and I thought, oh, okay, I look exotic, and so the messages were always just different, unique, exotic, and again, like still very much kind of disconnected from something that I felt was coming from me. And so honestly, even like I think maybe into well, definitely into my graduate program. Um, you know, I had this conversation with my advisor, and we had to do a competency project. As you know, like you're constantly evaluated and tested. And my thought was to do a project on first gen college students, which is a very big passion of mine. And I'm a first gen college student. My mom, didn't get a chance to finish her degree, and my advisor was like, "How about your identity? How about being Black Asian? I mean, what do you think of that?" And I thought, there's no research on this and why, and nobody would be interested in this. And it made me think like I was just so dismissive of my identity and just thought, it just didn't take up space because I didn't see it take up any space in school or with other people outside of just being kind of ornamental. And some part of me that kind of clicked and thought, was interesting. And so that's sort of like started this process. And I feel like that's when it started to become mine, and I gained more ownership over it through research, which is interesting because I hated research up until that point. And I thought like
Oh,
this, and a lot of it was really because I didn't see myself in it and I couldn't relate
yeah.
to it. And even like the process of research and, I practice qualitative psychology, qualitative research. And um, I feel like I could hear people's voices and even like the work that I did with participants, it just felt like just something I could relate to and connect with and added an entirely different dynamic
Yeah.
to what I originally perceived. And I'm still navigating it, who I am, what that means. And, I started my program at like, what was I, 35, 36 years old, so I was way into adulthood and a mom already and had a family. And so that's when I felt like, okay, this is something that's mine, and I can start to use the labels and words and, um, vocabulary around creating this for myself and not necessarily from the lens of other people.
Um, it's so interesting, when I talk to different guests, there are always going to be unique experiences because that's just the nature of being a person. That we all are having something unique, especially in this space where, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, like there's no one way to be multiracial, biracial, mixed race. However, there are these common threads that we see. And just for listeners to know, Kalya and I have spoken, a couple of times and we've talked about each other's research. And just as you said, this isn't something that's been brought up or there hadn't been space for this. It's exactly why I chose to research the experiences of mixed race employees, because there are lots of papers and books out there, other resources for people who are mixed race, but it's usually from an anthropological or sociological aspect,
Mhm.
not about what this means at work.
Mhm.
A place where no matter what your race is, we
Yeah.
all tend to shape ourselves a certain way for like whatever our work mask is, our work persona. And hopefully there are lots of people out there that don't feel a need to do that. But especially if you're a person that comes from a marginalized community, whether that means race or ability or any other sort of aspect of your identity that isn't mainstream, we usually tend to cover a few things, change a few things, and try to fit into some, I guess, mold. And I usually liken it to being this expectation of professionalism that's always seen through a Western or a white lens,
Right.
whatever that means to you. That could be language, that could be how you wear your hair, that could mean the food you bring to eat for lunch. So, I found what you described to be familiar and also validating. And you're like, I'm learning who I am still. And I say that's completely fair too. It's a journey. I'm not sure that there is an end to this journey. It's ongoing because I think it falls right into what we've learned about social identity theory. We do learn about who we are also through the lenses of other people, like what they reflect to us. We
Right.
learn how they see us, and it takes a while for us to see ourselves even apart from that. So I think that's all very fair. Anyway, the long and short of it is, I think that it's also very important for others to know and hear experiences from people where their upbringing plays a part in that, and the curiosity that people have. But in your case, you even mentioned a little bit of fetishizing, which is something that people have also described when it comes to being exotic. And don't you think it can be confusing, especially as a woman,
Oh
to
yeah.
think like, oh, I'm supposed to be beautiful in this way, or I'm supposed to
Yeah.
be whatever, but then also be like, really, that's how you see me? Like, I
Yeah,
don't
I think it's
know.
very confusing. And I think even like when I received that comment, and that was just something that was very overt. There are lots of, other comments that I have received over my entire life that weren't as so in my face, and
Sure.
um, I was a teenager too, and kind of coming
Yeah,
into
that's
my own, and I was still discovering what that would be, and so to get attention because of how, I guess, exotic, I was perceived to be at that time. There's something in also leaning into it, I think, for a lot of mixed race folk that comes with trying to, establish some visibility, get a sense of feeling like, okay, this is a privilege that I hold. And for me, at least, it was very misguided. And that's something that I'm learning to unpack, as well. But yeah, it's very confusing. I think we're taught that we should be appreciative of these kind of comments and that it's something that makes us special. And, even with my participants, that was for my dissertation, I focused on experiences of hypersexualization among Black Asian women, and that was something that came up quite often. Um, that experience
being
of
fetishized in some way.
being exoticized, fetishized, sexualized, and for being biracial or mixed race, but also the identities sort of connected with that too, being Black, being Asian, and all the stereotypes were tied into being hypersexualized. So I think we're often encouraged to to play out these parts in a performative way too, or how we present ourselves. And so, yeah, at like, what was I, 16, 17 years old, that made me feel really different. I'm like, "Oh, I'm like a painting," and, "Oh, like,
Yeah.
I'm worthy of being looked at because of, how different and unique I seem." So, yeah, and that's something that many people, mixed race, folk experience, men and women. So
Yeah, I would say that idea for me of being worthy of being looked at. Oh man, that messes with my head too because, when I was growing up, I my school was mostly white. I went to school in a mostly white community, but I did not live in a mostly white community. And
Mm,
so I would like leave my home, which was a predominantly black, neighborhood, where I'm going to be honest, I didn't really fit in there either, just because colorism exists. And I was always being told what I was thinking or how I felt as a light skinned person. You think you're this, or you're trying to be this, or why you talk white, or anything to challenge my blackness. And then to go to a predominantly white school, a Christian school, no less, where there was a lot of racism there. And it's really funny that I didn't see it as much until I looked back. Like, quick story. I have
Yeah.
a pen pal. She and I have been pen pals for almost 40 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
we were accidental pen pals. I was studying Spanish and somehow I got a German speaking pen pal. And it was like, oops. I mean, I did eventually get connected with this guy, Oscar from Chile. And Oscar and I think we exchanged like 2 letters. But my other friend, she and I are friends to this day. She lives in Austria and funny, I now speak German too. So we have that connection. Um, but when I was in middle school or high school or something like that, I decided to make her a video of my day-to-day life at my school because I had like my little 8 millimeter camera back in the day, young. Maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, I found them. And I got to rewatch these things and I was listening to the comments being made, to the things teachers said, students said. Because literally, I walked around with this camera all day long. I probably did it for like over the course of 2 or 3 days. And that little tiny sample set of my day as a middle schooler or high schooler, I don't know exactly what grade I was in. Oh my gosh, that was eliminating. And these are things that I probably internalized but didn't realize were coming out of me as an adult decades later. And to go back and watch that was so eye opening. And you mentioned this thing, you used a word as you were describing your experience with your identity development that really stood out to me because I've never heard it before. You said ornamental.
Mm.
And I think I've said accessory before, but truly ornamental, the exoticizing, but also a thing to look at, but also a thing that could be put away. So maybe you're in the spotlight for a moment and then, okay, enough of that. And away you go. Because ornaments don't need to have a voice, ornaments don't need to do anything except be ornamental. And I know that might not be what you meant as you're sharing that, but that is what I was thinking about.
Right.
That's what came up for me.
Yeah, I think that's what's come up for me. And that's what it feels like, and it's always through the view or perspective of the other. And it's very disempowering.
Mm.
And it's something that I have felt my whole life, but couldn't necessarily put a label on it.
Sure.
And even as I talk about it, I know that there are people out there that would challenge it and challenge what I'm saying about myself. And um which is also very sad, like, even I know this is kind of like a different topic, but, what was it when Trump talked about, Kamala choosing when to be Black and when not to be Black, and,
Yes.
it's kind of like a similar, sentiment, like, so it implies that that's not that she can't have ownership over, how she chooses to identify, 1,
Right.
and 2, that somebody else is supposed to dictate that. And so that's what it's always felt like, I think, to me, and, yeah, I think you captured it perfectly.
Oh, well, there's actual studies about this. Um, I think JD Vance, in the same vein of what you're discussing, referred to her as a chameleon.
Mm,
And
mm,
sometimes, when you talk about leaning into your identity, being a chameleon of sorts can be a superpower when you're trying to bring people together or when you are trying to connect with folks. You can put people at ease when they see a little bit of themselves in you, but then you're with a different group and maybe they see a little bit of themselves in you. There's power in that, but there is healthy advantage in that. Yet the dichotomy is that there's also studies that show how when a person can't figure you out, they have a lack of trust. It makes them feel like I don't know this, so I don't trust this. Ergo, I don't trust you. And so this idea of being a chameleon can be this double-edged sword where it can be a really great advantage and be a superpower and something that can be useful not only to the person, but to the people they're connecting with. And if you're a place, person working at an organization, you can benefit the organization by connecting with various stakeholders. So it's like, man, can I win? How can I win? I also write about this idea of a paradox of privilege. So
mm,
I think many of us know there is privilege in being different. There's also the risk of being othered when you're different. There's the idea, especially if you're a person who does hold some white identity or you have proximity to whiteness, you might have that sort of privilege. But
Right.
then there's the dissonance of, well, but I'm also still a person of color. I'm also still someone from marginalized communities. So is it okay if I talk about my experiences because it's not as bad as, and then fill in the blank of another
Right.
oppressed community?
Right.
Or can I lean into my fill in the blank identity?
Mhm.
Because I don't know if I'm enough of this or enough of that. So it's this weird paradox.
It is, and a lot of it also can depend on what you look like,
Yeah.
um, and is presentational in terms of how. So, in my case, being Black Japanese, I remember early on, my mother had made a comment to me, or not just it, she's told me this many times growing up, but like she was very concerned about my skin color, and she said to me, in this country, there is a lot of people who experience discrimination if you are darker than a paper bag,
Oh,
and
yeah, that's
something that she
historical.
had, right, and that's something that she had learned and had been taught about by my family, my father's family when she was still connected to him, and that's something that she made me aware of. So your proximity to that is also very critical, and even like in the context of Black Asian folk, but Asians and having model minority status and what that means, and your proximity to that piece and what it means for Black Asian individuals, looking more Asian, fitting into Asian stereotypes, and that being really promoted or encouraged by our by mainstream society that weighs heavily on everyone. But yeah, those are really important points that you're bringing up. Even like speaking to like what you were saying before, the chameleon comment, like that's like sitting with me. And it's been I mean, right now as an adult, I think I see it as privileges, but I think when you are growing up, having to almost in a hyper vigilant way, be aware of how you fit in an environment, social cues, the way that you speak, the way that you present yourself in different environments. Like, yes, it is a superpower. And I think I use it. Um, but it is also very distressing too, to be so constantly aware of these factors. But it's also necessary. It's a part of survival. Um, and it's something that also allows, I think, mixed race folk to be able to understand cultural differences and nuances, translate them. And yeah, in that respect, I think in organizational settings, that is an absolute superpower. I think then the question is, whether that individual wants to use it or whether they're tasked with using it, or if there's that expectation. And that's like a gray area that I don't, I'm not sure how to navigate yet entirely too, but I imagine that comes up as a question for many people.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about it, but I have had conversations with folks where they felt tokenized in general and serve as the quote, I'm doing air quotes, y'all, like the DEI
Mhm.
rep for whatever thing it needs to be they need to be representative of. Some like that,
Mhm.
and some don't, and I guess that gets right back to it as there is no one experience. Some people lean in and some people don't.
Right.
And that hypervigilance is absolutely a characteristic experience, one of those common threads where you're always like, who's like me? Who's not like me? How do they see me? And even a person like me, I identify as a Black woman, but I know that I have mixed racial heritage and I know that I'm very confusing to people. And I have my whole little elevator speech that I give when I'm asked about it, if I feel like it. That is
Mhm.
true. I don't always feel up to it, but that hypervigilance is exhausting.
It's very
You don't
tiring.
ever get to be off.
Yeah.
And so I feel you
Yeah.
there. Kalya, we talked about your experiences and what you've learned from your mother, but I was wondering about you as a mother. Is it okay if I ask you a little bit about that?
I'm still figuring out motherhood, but yeah, I hope I can give an articulate response.
I mean, I think that's fair. If you were like, bet, Shauna, I got motherhood down, I got mixedness down, I understand, then I'd be like, well, let's pull back a little bit. I think it's fair that we're all still figuring out life. But just from your own experiences, I wonder how being a mother or motherhood in general has impacted the way that you perceive your identity, or mixed race identity in general, even if it's not just your own?
Yeah. So I'm raising two kids, one 15-year-old, one soon to be 5-year-old, with their father, my husband, who is Dominican American. And so our kids are everything under the sun, which is wonderful. And it's something that we celebrate. I think, my husband and I have spoken quite explicitly about the kind of things that we want to talk about. And in terms of also like fully engaging in like what it is to racially socialize our kids and and that means like race talk in the household and talking about who they are and encouraging them to ask questions and also develop a vocabulary around their identity that feels salient to them. And as a mother, that's something that I've wanted to offer, particularly in the context of what I've been offered by my mom,
Mhm.
and also in the absence of my father too. There's a lot about being Black that I don't know that, have come in bits and pieces, and so my kids are fortunate to be able to engage in that dialogue with us, because they are Black, and what it means to be Black as a Dominican American, what it means to be Black as a Black Japanese person, and how that sort of exists within them. We openly, I think, talk about those things. I think also somewhat relatedly, for me, hair comes up a lot. I know, and it's so funny because I remember one of my first, clinical externship sites, talking with someone about hair in preparation for interviews. I used to straighten my hair quite often, like, obsessively, because I felt like I will only look presentable if I have my hair like this, and, this person, was white and thought I was talking about something very superficial, and I realized, wow, you have no idea where I'm coming from.
Right.
And so, like, hair is big for me, because I have so many internalized issues in terms of like, um, you know, the self-talk that I've had around my hair, looking presentable, looking essentially white, you
What
know.
what is considered professional, like when you
Yeah,
talk about interviews and things? Mhm.
right, right. And so I attempt to be careful about how I speak about hair with my kids, and further perpetuating things that they are probably hearing from the outside community or by the media. And they are, also like existing in a world that's very different from when I was a kid. It's not
Yes.
perfect, obviously, but it's very different. Um, but yeah, I'm really careful about unpacking my own internalized racism, and I try to talk about it with my colleagues. I try to talk about it with my husband, before I speak to my kids directly about that. And so that's something I'm still working. I'm not perfect. I know, like I'm giving my my kids something to talk about when they get older, but it's something I attempt to do in order to give to them and really kind of that or address that baggage that I'm holding, about how I see myself. So hair comes up for me quite often.
I can so appreciate that. I'm just hearing you talk about your intentionality with what you say around your children regarding hair is so admirable because I'm certain that I've probably said um, some disparaging things because it took me until I was well into my 40s
Mhm,
before I'd even go out of the house with my hair in its natural curly
mhm,
state.
mhm.
Like the chemicals, the straighteners, the heat, like
Yeah,
all the things to try to
and my
beat it
flat
into
iron.
submission. Flat
Right.
iron, blow dryers, then all the products that are necessary.
Mhm,
And, even when I was young, like as a student, as a child, God, please don't let it rain because if I'm at the bus stop and finally I got, my hair would be like nice, whatever
mhm,
nice was, any hint of humidity or rain would just ruin, not only frizz up my hair and make it, so I'm especially conscious then. But then there was the smell of the products. I always joke about we had this one product called Luster Silk. Y'all shout out if you, if you know Luster Silk. Pink hair lotion, Lord.
Yeah.
It had a certain scent to it. And I probably wouldn't have cared about it, except remember, I went to a predominantly white school then, and people would be like, "What is that?" Or, the
Mhm.
white girls would show up and they'd like, like toss their hair around, and it was the nice floral sense of whatever. Even to this day, I go into stores and I basically do an assessment as to where they keep products for people who have hair texture like mine and what they call it. And I'm so very proud. I actually got one store to change their merchandising because they had the end cap literally said like ethnic hair. And then
Mm.
it was like in the same aisle as like products for incontinence and stuff. And
Oh
then
my
they had
goodness.
another aisle that they called premium hair care. And it was things like, your, I'm just going to say the hair products that most people with
Mhm.
non-coarse or textured hair would
Mhm.
use.
To
And
be
I went
huge.
to the management and I was like, look, I'm normally not the let me talk to your manager type, but today I got time and we got to talk about this. What is this? And she's like, well, that's just, how we get it from headquarters. And I was like, all right, who do I need to write to? And I took photos and I sent it and they changed it.
Amazing.
I was so happy because I was like, thank you for hearing because, you know, again, othering. I have hair too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
And just
so
pull them into the corner, and that's just so symbolic for
I,
how.
I just don't understand why it has to be set apart anyway. And
Right.
are you familiar with Shea Beauty,
Yeah.
the company?
Yeah.
They had a whole campaign about it, like break down the wall, basically. Like, why are you segregating us?
I didn't
It's
know that.
segregation, like through hair care products.
Yeah,
So
not normalized, which has
yeah,
huge impacts. I mean, it's like the subtle things that, again, we are hypervigilantly,
yeah,
aware of. But otherwise, if you fit into the other camp and your products are more normalized and you are seen as more normal,
that's
um,
right.
you don't notice those things. But thank you
Yeah.
for doing that. And I feel like I'm about to do my own campaign. I've always noticed it and I've been kind of like irritated by it, but um, I haven't been able to do that extra step. That's so important.
Can we switch gears a little bit? I really want to understand a bit more about your work.
Mhm.
And I think this is so important because I got to tell you, as a person who has had therapists, it's very, very difficult to find somebody who gets it. And while there's never like the exact fit, whether it has to do with if a person can relate to you or you can relate to that therapist, man, to find somebody who gets it, I think is like the hugest step ever to start with before even getting into whatever it is that I want to discuss with a therapist. And so knowing that you really focus on helping people who are biracial or multiracial to me is a huge thing. I just wondered, both from your research, but also from your practice, have you found anything like tools or techniques that are really very helpful for your clients that are navigating their own identity and how they move throughout, the world as they see it, but also knowing how they're seen?
Yeah. Um, I love this book called The Pain We Carry. I may be quoting it incorrectly, but by Natalie Gutierrez. And it is trauma informed and focuses heavily on identity uh, in terms of intergenerational trauma that's passed down. And while she doesn't necessarily focus specifically on biracial, multiracial identity or mixed race identity, it's open enough to really be very inclusive. And that's something that has connected well with me. And I've worked with mixed race folk, but I don't have a huge, you know, caseload in that area necessarily, which I'm hoping to grow. It's changing now, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily look for therapy specifically to address those issues initially, but it comes
Sure.
out
Got
later
it.
on. And then that's where I come in and, attempt to really be curious about that lens. That's a tool for me that's been very helpful. I think my experience themselves, even though I haven't had yet a Black Asian client, I've had plenty of other mixed race individuals come and talk about, you know, that sort of complex existence of like, acclimating, adjusting to different communities and being able to sort of code switch, and some of like the distressing factors that come with, having to exist in a world from a stressful standpoint, so I've had a few people kind of navigate that with me in therapy. But yeah, I mean, in terms of a tool, that's what comes to mind first.
I think it's an advantage that you have even though you haven't had a client that I guess shares that much of your identity in the way that you describe, as being Black and Asian, but just being able to know what it's basically like. And also, I wrote down the book. I'm going to include that in the show notes for
Yeah.
listeners so they can check that out themselves. I did want to ask you because when you described the book first, you said something about it being trauma informed.
Mhm.
Can you explain what that means for folks who maybe haven't heard that term before?
Yeah, so I'm a trauma-informed therapist, and so what that means is that you have an awareness of the impact of trauma on your everyday life, and so that might include, for example, instances of sexual assault, molestation, abuse, events in your life that might have been, either ongoing or, singular events that occurred in your life that have an impact on your functioning in some way and also self-concept. And so a trauma-informed therapist would be aware of some of those factors and how they integrate into, why you're coming to therapy in the first place,
Sure.
how it impacts your interpersonal relationships and communication, how it impacts your self-talk and how you perceive yourself. And so I think that is critical when working with mixed race folk because there's a lot of, like we just talked about, a lot of mixed race folk don't necessarily have the opportunity to unpack over their lifetime until they are able to self reflect. And it could be through therapy, it could be through other means or other avenues too. Um, and so, uh, even the perception of, okay, this is a traumatic experience can feel like a lot to some people, or they might feel like, "Oh, well, it's something this situation is normalized, it's something that everybody deals with, it's not an issue." And so, I think being trauma-informed, in a therapy space allows you to sit with that a bit, a little bit longer and be curious about it, and also, bring some opportunity to just unpack those experiences with you and see the salience of it in your current life and, your connection to your past as well and how you wanna navigate the future, with new
Sure.
awareness.
Would you would you say, or have you found that sometimes folks don't even know that there has been trauma?
I think it's a very common experience, and, for that reason, I will, especially during a clinical intake, explain some examples, or even maybe that will come out later on, in like your fifth session, and then I might say, "Oh, well, this I'm curious, like, does this feel like it fits a definition of what we talked about our first session? Because it seems to, like, for example, a microaggression that you've experienced over and over again in a work environment, right? It seems to really be impacting your ability to go into work, your ability to function, your ability to really see yourself as welcomed in this environment. Does this feel like this fits that definition?" And so I really put it on that person because, another sort of factor to consider with trauma is that if you have the support systems and the tools and the coping mechanisms to manage things that are traumatic, right? You may not necessarily result in having trauma, right? So, because you've experienced an event doesn't necessarily make it uh,
Traumatic.
traumatic. I have my own definition, but maybe that's not something that fits with how they perceive their own experiences.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's something you navigate together, I think, with therapy.
You mentioned microaggressions as an example. What other things have come up for people, specifically in the workplace, that are identity related for multiracial people?
I think even from my more recent research on Black Asian individuals, there were many who talked about being hypersexualized in the workplace. So that means like,
At work, too.
Yeah, at work and sometimes violently.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and being expected to perform certain tasks because there is this perception of them being submissive, Asian, and maybe aspects of their identity were kind of torn apart and fixated on because of that, or their identity being brought up in a workplace when it wasn't necessarily initiated by them. And it's a very murky area because we're also talking about women. And so power dynamics are really inherent, I think, in the context of what was talked about with my research participants. But yeah, I think that oftentimes too, the legitimacy of their identity. How black are you? Do you know these attributes? Or do you know this music? Or how Asian are you? Can you say certain words? Or tell me this fact? And so being expected to perform aspects of our identity, I think, is something that many mixed race people experience and have become normalized. And sometimes you might be encouraged or then pushed to perform it yourself because you're so used to it. And this makes you different and offers you a little bit of privilege, and allows you to stick out. And so those are some things my research participants have shed light on. And I think for myself too, I've experienced that personally. Mhm.
As you're talking about it, I was thinking about another hair thing, of course, because that's such an important thing to me. And I will never forget, I was in a meeting where we were debriefing a presentation. There was three of us on the call, and my colleague was speaking about the presentation. My
Mhm.
boss interrupted my colleague and said, "Can we
Mhm.
just stop for a minute? Can we just stop for a minute and talk about Shauna's hair today?"
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, "Oh my God." And I know why he did that. It was because I had, remember earlier I said it took me forever to wear my hair in its natural curly state, right? So I had been wearing it naturally curly. That day was my birthday. And for fun, I straightened my hair. I was intentional about my look that day. It's not like I announced to everybody at work it was my birthday. It was for me.
Yeah, yeah.
And my colleague was amazing. This happened, and she paused for a beat, and then she was like, "Well, I think we need to talk about this presentation." So what I was saying was, and she took that spotlight off of me. And when I was like, thank you, God, because
Uh,
why did he do that? And I'm going to be honest with you, this was a black man who
mm,
you think would be familiar. And that's shame on me for having my assumptions, assuming that if we come from the same community or have a similar
mhm.
community, that I could expect that to not happen to me. But that's who did that to me. And here I am telling you about it. This was years ago, but it's
Yeah,
still something that impacted me. Who's going to notice if I straighten my hair today or not?
yeah. I'm sorry that happened to
Golly.
you. And it always puts you on the spot, and in a way so that you're expected to take a compliment or take it as a compliment or, be appreciative of a comment like that. And it catches us off guard. And I think that sums up many of our experiences, in the
Agreed.
workplace.
And was I supposed to take it as a compliment? Because it really wasn't. It was, can we talk about Shauna's hair today? Like
Yeah.
whatever comes after that, I don't know. I assume because people, place higher value on straight hair or whatever, that it was probably
That was my
meant as
assumption.
one.
Yeah.
But oh man, anyway, I'd like to ask you about belonging a little bit. I do a lot of work around workplace culture in general, but I do that through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bottom line, it boils down for me is I want from my clients in their organizations, the people that they serve in their organizations, to feel seen, to
Mhm,
feel heard, to feel understood, and
mhm.
ultimately to feel like they belong. I wondered if you might have had, either from your research or from your practice, some sense of how community can play a role in the lives of people who are biracial or multiracial in terms of feeling that sense of belonging, whether that's in work or outside of work.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes, like, our first inclination is to, think about activities or interventions that are focused on making other people feel more comfortable or included. But I think that even before all that, a lot of that work should be internal, and so um, that requires, I think, each of us, myself included, to really look at ourselves and go back into our own history and how we've been socialized, racially socialized, our own identities, and really being curious about those factors and how they have shaped us. And that, I think, precipitates any kind of like community work. I mean, um, before even like talking about how to attend to other people, understanding some of the obstacles or barriers that exist within us that don't allow us to foster that connection is critical and key. And I think a lot of therapists are trained to do that. They're supposed to be trained to do that. And it's something I'm still working on doing. But they come out, those unequal power dynamic, or those factors, biases, or those microaggressions, all that comes out if you haven't done that internal work or looked at yourself first, um, as a leader or as a community member. So that for me kind of sticks out as really critical. And I know that sounds disconnected, but for me it is very much connected because you will treat someone else like the other, until you see some of the power dynamics that exist within yourself or that you perpetuate in community settings. So that for me is really key, I think.
Mhm. And how about for the person who is mixed race or not feeling like they belong? There were times when, I mean, if I'm honest, I feel like could I have sabotaged a relationship because of my own insecurities? There could have been some relationships that were even stronger or better, but because I was so convinced I didn't belong, um, that I didn't allow anything to grow.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. But I just imagine that that potentially happens in workplaces too. Like I think I mentioned earlier, some of my respondents would say like, "Hey, I go to work. I don't socialize with anybody. I just want to do my work and go home because I don't want anyone to ask me questions." I think to myself like, what long-term effects of that if you intentionally don't try to develop community with others?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's hard. Even when you say that, some of the things I think about are there are a lot of people that have built up a shell because they've had negative experiences. And so they have said, this is a boundary here. I'm just not going to interact with these folks because I'm going to get hurt, which who can blame some people? I've
No,
heard
no
of
kidding. I mean, there's a reason I felt how I felt, and I imagine there's a reason people would put up
yeah.
those walls at work too.
Yeah. And I think sometimes even when people attempt to create safe spaces within a work environment, the intentions are probably good. But sometimes, when you think about being vulnerable in such a space and that leader or that person who has initiated that effort hasn't unpacked their own identity and how that may interfere with the safety of people participating in groups like that, it can be really counterintuitive. And so sometimes you see these superficial safe spaces created, and it feels like a duty, like certain affinity groups. It feels like a duty to take part in some of these experiences, but not authentically safe or not authentically inviting. And so, I think, yes, there are definitely some opportunities to create those kind of interventions or spaces for folks. But to authentically do so is hard. It takes a lot of internal work. Um, I think also checking in with people one on one is is great, without like the pressure of being in a group setting, or in small groups even, so that people aren't, you know, faced with the pressure to perform themselves. And so those are, I think critical as well. But again, precipitating all that is that internal work, I think, which is taking accountability and responsibility for even holding space for other folks, right? That
Sure.
that's not that's hard work.
So, Dr. Castillo, Kalya, thank you. This was a
Thank you.
phenomenal conversation, so insightful, and you've given us so many things to consider. I think whether you're a person who is mixed race or not. So I really appreciate the time that you've spent not only sharing about your own lived experiences, but your research and what you bring as a practitioner for folks who are navigating these spaces. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and asking such thoughtful, wonderful questions. I've learned so much from being with you today.
Oh,
I
Thank you.
appreciate
I'm glad always when we can learn together.
it.
Is there anything that you'd like to share with listeners in terms of maybe where they can find you, or your research, or anything you'd like to give a shout out to, or anyone you'd like to give a shout out to?
That's a great well, my family. My family who kind of they're teetering in the background,
Hi,
wondering about
family.
yeah, definitely my family for, just being a part of this process and journey for me and being so supportive. And, I don't have I wish I had a greater social media presence, but I have a website, orchidtherapyny.com. I have a LinkedIn with my name. I don't have much else. I'm not great at social media, but, yeah, I welcome anyone who has any questions or who wants to connect. That would be wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, thank
Mhm.
you again for sharing your time.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.